Today we're talking with Aaron, who has had interesting views on the latest conversation reports on the climate change. Aaron has a diverse background from poker professionally and so quote one of the best in the world, and also has a systematic background in academic, in quantitative, and teaches in different universities. Hi, Aaron. How are you?
Good. Nice to talk to you.
Aaron, scientists and politicians have been warning for many years that 2030 is a turning point in climate situation. Are we really in this binary situation?
Yeah, I don't think any serious scientist has said there's anything special about 2030. The longer we go emitting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the stronger the effect will be. But there's no dramatic turning point. There's no edge beyond which we can't go back.
Just to build on that, Aaron, so IPCC's report from 2018, they highlighted the point of no return should occur sometime between 2030 and 2052 with no exact date, as you mentioned. But the latest AR6 report was more emphatic that it should occur at some point around 2030 or 2040. So anticipating a little bit of this occurrence. Should we be alarmed at all?
Well, okay, there's two details that you sort of skipped over when you said that. First of all, to the extent there's any sort of threshold or barrier, what they're talking about is at some point, if we do nothing, it will be virtually guaranteed that the Earth will warm by 1.5 degrees centigrade. Personally, I think that's guaranteed anyway. I don't think I think we've passed that point. With the best will in the world, with the best international agreements, with the fastest increases in technology, the strongest responses we could do, I just don't see any way we can keep things under 1.5 degrees. Changes to the energy system take decades to put into practice, and they can take another decade before we see the full effect of the climate. So worrying about 2030 is worrying about some history that's already been written. Worrying about 2050, worrying about 2100, those are rational things to do. I was a risk manager for much of my professional career. And when you manage risks, you don't focus on the risks that you think are most important. You focus on the risks you can do something about. And we can do a lot about the climate in 2050. And they aren't expensive things. They aren't difficult things. We can do a tremendous amount about the climate in 2100. Climate in 2030, that's baked in.
But Aaron, something I'm struggling with. Suddenly, this latest report says that unequivocally, the human is a human-made event, this climate change. Suddenly, kind of they're confirming because of us. For me, it doesn't sound like a news. It's kind of why now this is a surprise. What is your view?
I think this is one of the kind of toxic strands in the climate change activism. It isn't even meaningful to talk about whether humans are causing climate change or not, whether it's anthropogenic. Everything affects everything. One of the study of weather and climate is where the butterfly effect was originated. And the butterfly effect claims, and this is literally true, that the flapping of a butterfly's wing in Brazil can cause a tornado in Texas 3 weeks later. The smallest tiny changes change weather all over the world and change climate. Given the tremendous impact humans have on the environment, I don't just mean CO2, I mean urbanization, deforestation, emission of other chemicals, changing of biology and chemistry of the sea, of the land, with agriculture. Of course, every single aspect of climate is influenced by humans. The climate, nobody knows what the climate would be if humans had never evolved, but it's a pretty good guess that everything would be completely different. So the reason people focus on things that are caused by humans is this quasi-religious belief that humans are bad and evil, that nature is good, and that anything humans do to affect nature is by definition bad. And that's not a scientific belief. It's a religious belief. So we know climate is thoroughly and completely, deeply affected by humans. What we don't know, we don't know very much about effective practical policies we can put in place today, what their specific effect on climate will be. We have some knowledge of the effect of CO2 emissions on temperature, but even that we don't know within about a factor of 2. And there are many, many other things we don't know. We don't know the effect of, say, a carbon tax on CO2 emissions. We don't know the effect of that on other technologies and the rest of the human environmental footprint. We don't know the effect on other climate things like winds and currents and rainfall, which are just as important as temperature to human comfort. So everything is anthropogenic, but that doesn't mean we know how to change our behavior in ways that will affect the climate in predictable ways.
It's great that you touched on that, because now I would like to talk a little bit about the solutions. I mean, the more we talk about a point of no return, the more we create this time pressure that might to some extent be unnecessary, right? And you have once mentioned that this time pressure would lead society to focus on irrational solutions that end up doing more harm than good. So what are these solutions, or even better than that, which rational solutions do you believe could lead us to the right path, assuming that by 2050 or 2100, we can actually contribute positively to solve this issue?
Sure. Well, the 2018 report that people use to say there's 12 years to climate disaster, or that 2030 is a tipping point, it was straightforward. The only way to reduce temperatures in 2030 is geoengineering. So that means scattering glass beads to reflect sunlight. That means injecting sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to reduce sunlight. Okay, they're cheap. They would work. They would definitely, reflect sunlight. They would lower temperature, but they have completely unknown long-term effects on the climate. They would affect everything about climate. They would be a tremendous change. They would be really stupid things to do. Now, I don't say we would never do those things. It might be worth experimenting with them. It might be worth, learning more about what the effects are. And maybe in 10 or 20 years, there'll be some room for geoengineering in our climate policy. But to change the temperature in 2030, we got to do an all hands on deck, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead implementation of these things. It's just not worth it. It's a crazy thing to do. If you say, okay, 2050, I care about the climate in 2050, now you can talk about things like gently steering technology in the right direction. Now you can talk about, subsidies and taxes. You can talk about international agreements, because let's be clear here, the climate in 2050 is in the hands of China and India. The developed world is already reducing emissions, and there's nothing it can do to reduce emissions fast. It'll make much difference. It's a question: can we persuade China and India to reduce emissions or slow emission growth? Actually, just politically, that's going to be impossible unless we can show people how they can continue to bring their populations out of poverty with doing it. This is a big job, but it's a doable job, and it's a job that's win-win. If we can bring lots of people out of poverty without increasing in human environmental footprint, not just CO2 emissions, overall human environmental input, we not only get a better overall environment, we lay the groundwork for future climate and environmental management, and we promote international peace and cooperation. I mean, this is exactly what we should be doing. It's cheap, it's easy. Well, I don't say it's easy. It is cheap, it's straightforward. We know what we have to do it, but it will take tremendous technological research. It will take tremendous political and diplomatic work. It would help a lot if we would stop fighting wars over, silly things that don't really matter compared to saving the earth. So there's a lot of things we do for 2050. For 2100, there's even more. For 2100, we really should be, I think there's just no excuse by 2100, humans should be in a situation where there's no more war, no more international violence. War is the biggest environmental problem by far, where the climate, the environment and other issues that affect everybody in the world are managed by a apolitical expert global group of some sort. I don't mean necessarily we have to subscribe to a world government and abolish nations, but it's just crazy that 230 nations are individually setting environmental policy for emissions for the planet. So some sorts of international agreements, some sort of panels that get international respect. These are the things we should be growing. Unfortunately, the IPCC, which was set up to do precisely that, it was set up precisely to, get a global group of scientists having sort of the first word on these issues. It became an activist, highly politicized organization that distorts evidence. The IPCC reports are actually pretty good. I read them. I read the whole ones. I haven't finished reading the latest one yet, but I'm working on it. They're quite readable. The underlying data is quite good. But as it sort of works up to the summaries, it gets more and more politicized. But even the top level global summary, if people read that, they would find it says an awful lot less than what the activists are claiming, what the headlines would get you to believe. So it's the IPCC is a step ahead of letting lobby groups and politicians decide these things. But if it took a longer term view, if it's our goal is not to force people to jump on board to these short-term solutions and worry about 2030, our goal is that by 2030, we are a respected organization, not considered a partisan organization. We're like the Underwriters Laboratory. We're like the International Standards Institute, something that everybody accepts. Nobody thinks is politicized. It's just the facts. And it would be a tremendous improvement. That's what we need for long-term systematic improvement. Geoengineering to reduce the temperature by a couple tenths of a degree by 2030 is just a crazy approach that probably wouldn't work. And it's because it's such a bad approach, it would spiral into other things. I mean, one thing people I don't think have considered enough, once we can control the weather, let's say we do this, let's say we do geoengineering, it works perfectly. People aren't going to sit around and say, oh, great, let's, just minimize human impact. I want, hot places to be cooler. I want cold places to be hotter. They're going to start changing the climate for human comfort. That's a gigantic, risky step. Again, we may do it someday, but we need to know an awful lot more about the earth, the climate, the environment before we would even think about doing such things. So it's kind of like, research. Once you build a nuclear bomb, people are going to have nuclear bombs and people are going to use them to kill people. Once you geoengineer the climate, people are going to geoengineer the climate.
It's a clear message that we got to act rationally at the end of the day, right? Going forward, especially. But what do you believe could be the effect in the economy or society in general if we collectively hurry up to seek irrational solutions such as the ones you just mentioned?
I think that's just always the bias of government, right? You can't just do nothing, right? The rational thing, President Biden, I'm President Biden, I stand up and say, okay, we got a serious climate problem. We got other environmental problems, by the way, that I think are just as serious, but climate is a big one. And we really can't do anything about 2030. If we're talking about rejiggering the entire energy infrastructure, even if we're just talking about the US, we're not even talking about China and India. That's a tremendous job. That means changing the way highways are built, where gas stations are, where power transmissions are, where pipeline. These are decade-long infrastructure projects to make much difference. And I were to say, okay, I can't really do much, but I'm going to try and push these in the right direction. I'm going to increase funding for certain research. I'm going to, put some taxes and subsidies and things to kind of hope things get a little better. Well, people say you're doing nothing, right? You're climate activists say that you have this huge problem. You can't just do nothing. Well, the answer is we can't do very much. Better to do a little bit of good that is good than to do these dramatic programs. You really have no idea what the long-term effect is, but you never get reelected doing that, right? You got to have a plan, or you got to oppose all plans. You got to say all these plans are just, communist takeover of the United States, socialist nonsense based on pseudo. That's crazy too. There are sensible, cheap things we can do that do general good. And instead of doing them, half the people want to do more, which is risky and silly and wasteful, and half the people want to do nothing.
But Aaron, just to wrap up, I want to be mindful about the time. Should we be optimistic?
Oh, yeah, I'm very optimistic. Technology is making things much, much, much better. As long as, if we can avoid war, if the US and China don't go to war over the South China Sea, if the US doesn't try to do another, regime building in the Mideast, if Russia stops invading its neighbors, I think if we can avoid war, as people come out of poverty, as technology improves, as communication improves, the world is going to get a lot better. I really think I would love to live in 2100. I think that is going to be a paradise compared to the way things are today, just as today is a paradise compared to the 1950s. But we could screw it up. and I think war is the biggest problem. Silly activism, crazy environmental rules, things like that, we'll survive that. War is the one thing that could really mess things up.
Well, thank you, Aaron. It was very nice, very lively. Thank you very much.
Thank you
very much.
Enjoy it a lot. Yeah.